Well, hello and welcome to the LLG Grapevine podcast. You're listening to Deborah Evans, LLG's Chief Executive, and I'm joined today by Dennis Hall, the LLG Bulletin Editor.
Hi, everyone.
Well, what a busy time of the year, Dennis. And one of the highlights for me last week was certainly attending the Welsh regional event for the junior lawyers at the Law Society in Cardiff, which had been sponsored by Brian Jacobson. Now, this was particularly interesting in a number of ways. It was focusing on public law in Wales, and it was fascinating to me just what the differences were. For example, litigators in court are now going to have to be wary of not just what the law says in English, but what the law says in Welsh as well. And it was made very clear that a translation of Welsh law is not enough. You have to pay particular attention to both the text and the syntax, because if you translate Welsh law, you can actually change the meaning. And this actually, it was blowing my mind, but apparently it's not an uncommon thing to have to do in a number of countries. Places like Canada and Hong Kong, for example, have to look at the legislation in two languages and understand the nuances across those two languages. Because as you know, sometimes a word can mean very different things in one language to another. So I found that fascinating. And then also that there's a lot in Wales with respect to really looking after sort of the provenance and the future sustainability of the Welsh language. And that particularly applies to the provision of education and the requirements to consult when changing anything to do with schools, if it is expected to have an impact on the delivery of education in the Welsh medium. And as well as really enjoying the content, I met a lot of extremely nice and very highly skilled people. And I had a fantastic conversation and a really good day out. So I'm really looking forward to going back to Wales in the future. Now, for something different, something that caused a bit of a stir under the last government was a concept that's been used in other industries, but not favoured, it seems, certainly by central government for use in local government. Now, Dennis, you might know what I'm talking about here. It's the 4-day working week. So, Dennis, tell us what you know.
Well, yes, indeed. And this is an item we've covered before. You will recall the controversy between the last government and South Cambridgeshire District Council over their introduction of a 4-day week. They produced a report too that demonstrates numerous efficiencies, but the last government was having none of it and issued best value notices. But now, a new government and a new change. Under a 4-day week, officers at the council are expected to carry out 100% of their work in around 80% of their contracted hours, for 100% of their pay. But the previous government had issued best value notices to South Cambridgeshire in November 2023 and in May 2024 in a long-running row over these arrangements. And these notices called on the council to demonstrate how it was delivering its best value duty. And in a letter to South Cambridgeshire's chief executive, the ministry has now said, as the Deputy Prime Minister Angela Rayner reiterated at the recent LGA conference, this government is committed to working as partners in power, with mutual respect underpinning our approach. And this means an end to micromanaging local authorities. And the ministry letter went on. Although it is not government policy to support a general move to a 4-day working week for 5 days worth of pay, we recognise that local authorities are independent employers who are rightly responsible for the management and organisation of their own workforces. And with this in mind, the ministry said the notice will not be reissued. Now, in July this year, South Cambridgeshire hailed an independent report on the trial produced by the University of Cambridge and the University of Salford, which found that 22 of 24 key performance indicators actually improved or remained the same under these new arrangements. Perhaps this decision might encourage other councils to take a close look at this interesting and unusual initiative. Deborah.
Well, it is indeed fascinating, Dennis, and we shouldn't just get caught up in doing the same thing that we've always done in the same way for years and years. It's always sensible to have a rethink. And indeed, I was talking to somebody at the Wales meeting who said that in their council, the general practice on a Friday is that if you can get your work done by 3 o'clock, for example, you can leave early. And they talked about it being a really different mentality on a Friday, and that the work was done in a very sort of intensive way so that you do achieve your full day's work in a short amount of time. And that's very much what the 4-day week is about. It's not working part-time. It's really about working more intensively and leaving all of those things out of the day that suck up your time and stop you from being productive. And it does not damage productivity, but it does increase motivation if it can be done properly. So I think it's worthy of consideration, but let's see where that goes. So what else has been in the news? Well, Companies House has released a policy paper talking about a transition plan for upcoming changes to UK company law. Now, you may have heard of the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act that came into force in March. Now, this provided greater powers for Companies House to query information, stronger checks on company names, new rules for registered officer addresses, new lawful purpose statements to confirm that intended future activities of the company will be lawful. And they've also got more effective investigation and enforcement powers as well. And there's lots of things in there about data sharing with law enforcement agencies, etc. Now, the aim of this is to give Companies House the power to play a more significant role in tackling economic crime and supporting economic growth. Now, the measures are intended to improve transparency and more accurate and trusted information on their registers. So obviously from a local authority perspective, this is quite important. There are new responsibilities for all new and existing company directors, people with significant control of a company, and anyone who files on behalf of a company. So that's definitely worthy of a look. And obviously many of you will be advising your council on the companies that you hold, so one to bear in mind. Now, moving on, obviously we've had some great announcements recently from Angela Rayner on remote meeting provision, and also talk about sanctions from a standards perspective. But she has made another announcement which has proved controversial within the sector. Dennis.
Indeed she has, Deborah. And of course, every local authority legal team has responsibility for the right to buy council housing system. But as you say, big changes lie ahead. The Deputy Prime Minister has suggested she wants to stop new council homes in England from being sold under the right to buy scheme. Angela Rayner told the BBC that the government would put restrictions on the new social homes in England so that we aren't losing that stock, she said. For decades, the right to buy scheme has allowed social housing tenants to buy their homes, often at a significant discount. And Angela Rayner said the country was facing a homelessness crisis as she announced £10 million to help rough sleepers get through the winter. Now, the right to buy scheme itself was introduced by Margaret Thatcher's Conservative government in 1980. But since then, more than 2 million homes have now been sold. And the policy was initially credited with increasing rates of home ownership, but more recently has been blamed for contributing to the rise in homelessness. Labour has pledged to build the largest number of social and council homes since World War II, and Ms Rayner told the BBC that she doesn't want those newly built properties leaving the system. Last month's budget also saw new measures allowing local authorities to keep all the money they receive from council house sales, a policy the last Conservative government also followed for 2 years, but until March 2024. Deborah.
Well, I mean, obviously, we know there are great challenges in the provision of affordable housing, and the government's looking at taking this multi-layered approach to adequately address this problem. But it's not just housing that's seeing massive changes. employment law too is being overhauled substantially. Now, the government's setting out to modernise the employment rights framework and respond to the changing world of work. So this probably fits in quite well with that thinking on the 4-day week you were talking about as well. So they're looking really at rebalancing the relationship between worker and employer. Now, it's an ambitious agenda, but it does have an explicit mission to kickstart economic growth. Now, this set of proposals is called Make Work Pay, and it's one of their big priorities, and they're looking at legislation very quickly on this, obviously, so that the bill is already out there. And there's a great transcript by Naomi Cook at the LGA if anybody is interested in listening to it, which there's a link to in our bulletin. So you may ask, what is being changed? Well, there's the introduction of day one rights, which means on your very first day in work, you get protection for certain things. Now, these cover things such as parental leave, sick pay, family leave, unfair dismissal, but only following a probationary period. And there's talk of, I think it's a probationary period of up to 9 months to be included in the law around this. It impacts on your ability to fire and rehire. And it also talks about sectoral collective bargaining, and it's reintroducing the school staff negotiating body and the adult social care negotiating body, which can determine pay and other terms and conditions for workers in these sectors. Now, the government is expected also to bring a revised equalities bill in the new year as well, and that is going to look at gender pay gap action plans and the need to produce ethnicity and disability pay gap reports, and demonstrate really how you're supporting employees with menopause symptoms to remain active at work. Now, with 94% of councils recruiting difficulties in recruiting and retaining staff, it's going to be interesting to see if these measures increase recruitment into the sector. Now, the sector has always been a good employer on a number of metrics, but it can't compete with private sector pay for professional roles, as we all know. So, Dennis, we're a nation of animal lovers, and many people take great comfort from having their dog with them. I can assure you mine is asleep on my feet as we speak. But what about in the workplace?
Well, this is interesting. A court bailiff has lost a case against her employer to bring her dog to work as an emotional support animal. The bailiff, a Miss D. Cullingford, brought her miniature Yorkshire Terrier with her when she was carrying out debt collection jobs for the local county court. However, colleagues spotted the dog in Cullingford's car and informed management. Cullingford's bosses said that the dog, called Bella, could not accompany her on jobs as she was not a guide dog, and emotional support dogs were not protected in law. The bailiff resigned and brought a claim against the Ministry of Justice, which is responsible for the county court service, and she argued that her employer had failed to make reasonable adjustments to allow her to bring Bella to work. Cullingford argued that her role involved confrontations, and the presence of her dog helped her to deal with the stress and enabled her to work far more effectively, and it benefited her mental health and well-being and her ability to work at her fullest capacity. Now, the judge dismissed the claim, saying that management had legitimate concerns regarding the security of her vehicle, general health and safety, and the risk of escape or interaction with the public. Now, we know that other employers have been known to take a very different approach in the legal sector and elsewhere. But here's the question: what about your legal officers in your council? Does your council allow employees to bring their dogs in? Would they have allowed Bella in? What do you think? Let us know on the LLG forum page. Deborah.
Well, as we know, Dennis, I do absolutely love my dogs, but I can see that not everybody always feels the same way. And obviously they have a tendency to bark. Some people might be allergic to them, but It is quite well known to improve office mood and well-being, and I do know of a number of solicitors firms that do allow dogs in their office, and a number of professional firms as well. I've yet to see them in councils, I have to say. Anyway, finally from me, I'd like to just mention the Susie Lamplugh Trust, which is a personal safety charity, and that's called for minimum standards for licensing taxi and private hire vehicle drivers. Now, the reason they're doing this is because they found 90 active licenses were held by drivers with convictions for violent offences, which is alarming, really, isn't it? And they thought that a consolidated legislative framework is imperative for public safety, and they recommend a policy that clearly specifies which crimes and behaviours result in the revocation of a driver's licence. Obviously, way back in 2014, the Law Commission reviewed the legal framework surrounding taxis and private hire vehicles across England and Wales. And in its final report, it talked about a new single legal framework for the regulation of those vehicles across England and Wales, with the aim of making it simpler and more modern. And guess what? Those recommendations are still awaiting a government response. So that there's been quite a few studies in this, and evidence presented in the Susie Lamplugh report, etc., shows that concerning loopholes still exist, with certain drivers being licensed despite having known convictions for violent offences. And this is something that we really do need to get a grip on. So the Trust argues that it's imperative that a single consolidated legislative framework be implemented that sets specific minimum standards for drivers to ensure consistency across all licensing authorities to better protect the public's safety. Now, sticking with licensing, the Institute of Licensing has indeed published updated guidance for licensing authorities when considering the suitability of applicants and licence holders for taxi and private hire, driver, operator and vehicle proprietor licences. Now, the latest guidance replaces the guidance from 2018 and is endorsed by LLG. And we have to give thanks to our licensing Deputy National Lead, Stephen Turner, here for all his efforts in this area, as he's worked closely with the Institute as the Sustainability Working Group Chair, which sounds very impressive indeed. Now, Stephen said in relation to the updated guidance, it's intended to inform those who regulate the hackney and private hire trades. It's been produced following extensive consultation and considers the views of regulators and the trades, and it's hoped that many licensing authorities will adopt it and use it to assist their decision making in order to deliver their duty to protect the public. Well said, Stephen. And on that note, that's it for another edition of the podcast. You can read more on any of this in bulletin number 43, available on the LLG website. So it's goodbye from me.
And from me too. Bye now.